Welcome to First in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write better fiction. I'm Aaron Giansky, author of The Bargain, The Hand of Adonai series, and First in Fiction.
And I'm Heather Luby, the managing editor of the Citron Review.
Tonight, Steve is not with us. He may join us later, so we are hoping that will happen if he gets some time. He's out of town on some business. He's out in a hotel room, and I think he's actually eating dinner right now because dinner is more important than writing. Needs to get his priorities right, I think. But tonight we've got a topic that seems to be kind of by popular demand. It was something suggested by one of my students on interior monologue and how to handle that. And it's one of those things for me that can really make or break a book. A novel with too much interior monologue can kind of be a little bit annoying. It can drag. Something with not enough interior monologue can make us feel too distant from the character. So there's really a balance that you want to strike, and it's always a struggle for writers to find that proper balance. So we're going to talk about that tonight. Heather, did you have anything just off the top of your head that you wanted to contribute or start off with?
No, I think I'm ready to sort of dive into the questions here, though I would agree that since I sort of mainly write from the first person, the struggles that you can sort of face writing internal monologue, I didn't really face them with my first novel, but I'm right now working on a third-person novel with two sort of protagonists.
Right.
And
okay.
Yeah, and so I'm feeling this is a great topic because it's sort of a different thing to attack depending on the point of view you're using.
Yes, it is. And I guess that's one of the first things that we should mention is point of view. It's going to be different for first person than it is for third than it is for second. Specifically, though, you'll see first person and third person close are very, very similar. Second is a little bit different, and third omniscient is also different because you can actually go into multiple characters' minds, though I would recommend against doing that within a particular scene. If you're going to go into multiple perspectives, you want to do it scene by scene and try and limit it to one character. That seems to be kind of the way to handle things these days. Why don't you talk, if you don't mind, Heather, a little bit about the differences in point of view and how you handled interior monologue in your first novel, which is first person, and the one that you're currently working on?
Well, I guess I'm going to start off by saying, in case we have any writers that are listening in, that I can't imagine but are wondering what interior monologue is, right? I looked it up earlier to get a very formal-sounding definition, and I found one that said interior monologue is a narrative technique that exhibits the thoughts passing through the minds of our protagonists, right? And whether this be something like the free associations, the stream of consciousness, or whether it is more of a rational, structured sequence of thought and emotion, both are considered internal monologue. In more of a layperson's term, right, it's what characters think in their heads, right, that is revealed on the page to your reader. I know for me, when I was writing Laws of Motion, I sort of felt like, I took on the persona of my character. We've talked about this in other podcasts. So being inside of his head and writing in that manner through first person came rather seamlessly for me. It really didn't feel like I was having to step out of the narrative and be, more authorial and looking at it really as the writer-creator. I was really so much in the headspace of my first-person character that I was telling the story. I was in my own head, which was the character's head, if that makes any sense.
Right. Right.
But with third person, it is different. You're trying to balance giving, as you said before, either too much information, which can slow down a scene, but also not. But if you don't give enough, right? This is how you make an emotional impact with your reader. Your readers can only see so much through the actions of your characters. It is through the revelation of who they are inside, and often the point and counterpoint of sort of what is going on out in the world and what's going on in your character's head that play off of each other, that do the best job of revealing character. And so I feel like even in my first draft, I'm weighing over what thoughts to include or not to include more than I ever did when I was writing in the first person.
I agree. I think in first person most
because I feel like there's
are,
more natural distance, right?
right. With third person there is that distance. In first person there seems to be less of that distance. Most writers writing in first person would probably express a similar experience to you, that the thoughts seem to come naturally and seamlessly. I know a lot of beginning writers really struggle with how to punctuate it and how to differentiate between what they're thinking and what the author is saying. In first person, you don't have to worry about that because the author is the narrator. But I would also say that even in third person, you don't need to put thoughts within quotation marks. You don't need to put thoughts in italics. The reader's going to get it. I think part of the problem is, as writers, we don't trust our readers enough. So we'll say things like, X, Y, and Z, he thought, or I thought to myself X, Y, and Z. And that's fine, but we could even drop the I thought, he thought, and move directly into the thought itself, and the reader is going to understand, okay, this is what they're thinking. I experienced something in some of my edits today, going over some work that I thought was kind of interesting. And that is something that just completely slipped out of my mind. I can't. Oh, now I remember. I had this great point to make, and then it was gone.
Where is Steve for our comic relief right now? You know he
exactly. He would have some sort of witty comeback. So Steve, we miss you. Somebody, the character had a thought about, oh, this other character must be thinking this, or this other character must feel this way. Clearly, I think the adverb was in there. Clearly, they felt this. However, that's problematic because I'm not seeing what it is that makes this clear to the character. So my question to the writer was, what external stimulus has enacted or spawned, if you will, this internal reflection? What is it that they have seen externally or experienced externally that they have then internalized in this manner, that they've interpreted in this way? And with interior monologue, one of the things that's going to make it really strong is being able to match the exterior and the interior, showing how this leads to this. And that creates a logical flow for the reader to follow, rather than a thought that seems kind of out of place, almost an orphaned thought. Like, why? It makes no sense for the character to think this right now unless the author is making them think it. Instead, you want the reader to come to the same conclusion as the character. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it does. In fact, I think a lot of times internal thoughts, this internal monologue, is best paired with real action in the story, with some type of driving force of the narrative. I think that thoughts and inner dialogue should be there because they also advance the plot. I think too often, you know, when you're first writing a piece, maybe if you're new to writing, your instinct is you want to put in everything, especially if you're writing in first person, because it does come more stream of consciousness. So you sort of have to stop yourself, and you need to go back and look over that work and think, okay, what aspect of this internal monologue that I'm sharing is actually serving the purpose of advancing my plot, or revealing my character in a way that I couldn't do with an actionable item, right? They couldn't be done externally, but must be done internally. You kind of have to be a little picky about what you include. Yeah,
I agree. I like that word. You have to be picky. You have to be choosy. I said a couple weeks ago when we were talking about dialogue, less is more. You really want to trim it back. And I think the same thing is true with interior monologue. My example is the Hunger Games. And a lot of people love the Hunger Games, and I enjoyed it as well. But at some point, I got a little tired of Katniss and her, oh, Peeta, oh, Gale, oh, Peeta, oh, Gale. And I've been told several times, it's because you're a man, and this is how women think and feel. I don't know if it's a gender thing. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's a gender thing, but at least for me, personality-wise, that got to be a little bit much. I got it. It felt redundant in the same way that a lot of dialogue to me feels redundant and can be stripped back. And I was mentioning with a group of writers that with dialogue, what we tend to do is overwrite. And so we write 3 or 4 or 5 sentences trying to find the right one. And our job as editors, self-editors, is to go back and take out the 4 or 5 that we wrote originally just to get us to the proper line, the gem of the dialogue, if you will, that great line that's going to live in infamy forever. It's the same rule, I think, with interior monologue. We will overwrite on our first drafts, and our second drafts, our job of our second drafts is to pare it down to just the simple, essential thought. Something as simple as, he's lying, or he won't look at me, he must be lying, or something like that. Anything like that, to where we can just condense it down to the utmost that's going to get us inside the character's mind, and kind of help move the character development and the plot forward.
Yeah, I think that the risk that we run with internal monologue, like dialogue, is that we get a little self-indulgent. And if you really treat internal monologue like dialogue, meaning, you know, no one likes to read nor would want to write a character that is so self-indulgent, that takes up so much space on the page and is so self-involved. And I don't mean this in terms of character personality. I just mean in terms of the presence that they have on the page that is so squarely focused on being inside their head. You know, you wouldn't want to go to a dinner party with this person. So when you think about what internal monologue you want to share, you should be using the same type of barometer, right, that we would with dialogue. Picky,
right.
Picky.
Exactly. And let's I mean, we could probably make some assertions, such as internal monologue is not really the place to tell, right? It falls under the same rules as showing versus telling. We don't want to tell backstories in the guise of memories.
I do not like that.
Right. We don't want to basically try and tie together loose ends that we just haven't. You know, that's the job of the narration. That's the job of the prose. That's the job of the forward momentum of the story. That's not the place for internal monologue to be moving the story. The point of internal monologue is to enrichen the story. Is that even a word, enrichen? To enrich? To make rich?
But we're
I'm
just
a writer.
Yeah, exactly. But you're right? It's really, I think it best serves the narrative when it comes in short bursts, when it illuminates an action, when it gives us that flip side of a coin, or we get to go a little bit deeper. But I prefer it in these short bursts. You know, I don't want paragraphs of being inside someone's head. I think it's why, at least for me personally, and this is a completely personal statement, why I'm not particularly crazy about sort of stream of consciousness novels in general. And you know, Aaron, from submissions that we read at the Citron Review, it's not like I cannot be swayed, but again, generally speaking, I'm just not really drawn to pieces that are that sort of internally focused. So if I'm reading a novel and you're giving me big blocks of internal monologue, that's going to turn me off. I also think it's going to be an issue with pacing, right? Internal monologues can slow the pace of a scene. While they can reveal character motivation and they can give you character voice, again, sparingly.
Yeah. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the term stream of consciousness, it's the idea of the entire story itself is within the character's mind, and there's very little, if any, externalization, and everything is told in this kind of loosely connected thoughts and ideas. You'll see somebody on their deathbed remembering their life and jumping from detail to detail. You'll see at the Citron Review, what we see are the park bench stories where a dude sits down on park bench and reflects on his life. And absolutely nothing happens. Like, he doesn't even feed birds. Like, there's no bird seed in a bag next to him. Nobody sits down and says, those must be comfortable shoes. Nothing ever happens except dude sits on park bench and thinks.
And you want to say, you know, you're not, it's not that character's not that interesting. And even if they were, it's still not that interesting.
You know, in all fairness, it would be terribly boring if you got inside of my head and spent that much time in there. Like, it's just not that exciting to spend that much time inside somebody's mind without moving the story forward. You really run the risk of alienating readers, or just kind of irritating readers, or the readers getting bored and simply saying, when does something actually happen? When is that momentum going to be achieved? Go ahead.
I was going to say, speaking of stream of consciousness, because you just said bored, and I'm like ADD over here, and the idea popped in my head that I had earlier when you were talking about like italics and sort of
Yes.
like more of the formatting question. I was thinking I wanted to mention that I completely agree not to use quotation marks whatsoever when you're sharing internal monologues, dialogues, and I personally agree with the italics as well. I know that there are novels that exist out there. I'm sure excellent novels that exist out there that are using italics. And I think that there's definite pros to it. But for me, the cons outweigh the pros. The biggest con for me being is that I think the reader can grow tired and bored of the constant changing of font, of going in and out of these internal thoughts. I think that you can have within a narrative a combination of using italics and not, if it's done well and if it's done consistent. But that's a very nuanced sort of thing. I would really tell most writers that, like you said, trust your reader.
Yeah.
And it's more obvious than what you think.
Yeah. And the way I would handle it is I would leave it up to the editor. I would send the story in, I would submit it, send the novel in, submit it, and then let your editor say, hey, we really need to put these in italics. This is going to be more of an editorial kind of a decision, a publication kind of a decision, what format they want to stick with, how they do things at their house, how they do things at their magazine. That's fine. That's fine. Let them make that call. This isn't something that's worth arguing or fighting over. But just for the most part, us as writers, really the goal is to be able to move seamlessly from one to the other. Jerome Stern in Making Shapely Fiction talks about this thing. He calls it juggling, a technique called juggling, which is moving between action and thought. And it's if you don't have that book, it needs to be on your bookshelf. It's Jerome Stern, Making Shapely Fiction. I wish I had it with me. I think it's actually at school still. I would put it up to the screen. I would say, go buy it. But Making Shapely Fiction, look it up, Amazon.com, Better Books, is it?
Better World Books.
BetterWorldBooks.com, I think, has some copies of it. And I would go there and buy that and have that on your shelf and look at the chapter called Juggling. In fact, I wrote a scene, and I thought we might do something a little bit different tonight, Heather. I wrote a scene with this idea, this juggling idea. If you're listening on the podcast, please go onto YouTube and do a quick search for Firsts in Fiction and find the interior monologue one so that you can kind of see and follow along. It's easier to see than it is to just simply listen to it. But I thought it's a couple pages. I thought we might take a quick look at it. And I'm going to let you kind of critique it. Fair warning, I wrote this.
Terrific. You didn't prepare me for this whatsoever.
On the spot, surprise. But I thought it might be real practical, and it just occurred to me, wow, I've got an example that I use in my classes for this. Fair warning, I wrote this years and years and years ago. I have not done a good edit on it, so it's definitely not my best work, but it's a rough draft, and it'll serve the purpose. So basically what we'll do here, I'm going to go ahead and turn on my screen share. And see, you guys, you tell me if this is working.
Okay.
Right, can you see my screen now? Lots of stuff. How about that? Can you see it now? I
can.
Is it readable at all?
Yeah, it's readable for me.
Okay. So I'm going to go through this real quick, and kind of, as something comes up, let me know, because I can't see you right now. I'm just looking at the page, but we'll give this a shot. So this says, Cameron had lived in the mountain desert for most of his 35 years and never seen it rain this bad. So already we've got somebody we've got some rain happening, and we're within their perspective interior monologue because he's never seen rain like this. The streets were flooding, and he was speeding, so we've got some action. He passed a car on the highway, jerked the wheel slightly, felt his tires slip, so we're in solid action here. He went to plug his right hand on the stack of paper. Put his right hand on the stack of papers in the passenger seat, but not quickly enough. They fluttered to the floorboard, some between the seat and the passenger door, some between the seat and the center console. He cursed under his breath, felt the car regain traction, and started to pick them up. So this first paragraph, we have action. We've got a guy driving too fast in the rain. Then the next line, we have papers. So many papers, so very many papers. Probably a little redundant, but you get the idea. Here is a switch. Go ahead.
That's what I was going to say. And we had action. We have slipped seamlessly into a third-person internal thought. And as a reader, I got it immediately. And as you said, there are no quotation marks. There are no italics. There are no tags of he thought. But you feel completely, again, close inside of the head of this character.
And some of that becomes because these are incomplete sentences, and rarely do we think in complete sentences. So a little bit of that is grammatically, there's a bit of a grammatical tell there. You know, that's where the first switch occurs. And if we kind of move on, we've got a little more of the characterization with his thought process of what happens next. He could hear the voices of his students the next morning, so this is something that he's imagining happening in the future. They'd say things like, "Mr. Watson, my paper wasn't folded like this when I turned it in," or "How did my paper get creased like this?" Some, the bold, would say, "Is this a coffee stain?" To which Cameron would say, "It was raining. Deal with it." So characterization there, and that is not necessarily dialogue, but it's imagined dialogue, if you will, which is why it's all within the same paragraph. Normally in dialogue.
Right, without paragraph breaks and so forth, right.
Yeah, exactly. So we're still with the head. Then another paragraph, and at this point, you know, it's okay, but I'm wondering if I'm, and you could probably weigh in on this, I'm wondering if this whole next paragraph is also thought. I'm wondering if I'm staying too long within his mind and not enough action. There were times where he enjoyed teaching at Kingside Prep. The caliber of work was light years ahead. Blah blah blah. I don't even know why I'm reading this.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I think that in this particular moment, the momentum that you gained with that opening paragraph, that created a little bit of tension or menace, has dissipated at this point.
Right, because at this point, we've been in his mind for 3 paragraphs without any sort of reminder that he is doing something that's unsafe. We have no reminder.
He's on a rain-slicked road, and that he was driving a little fast. His tires, like you said, were having a hard time gripping the road. We've lost that sense of menace in the piece at this point.
I would agree. And then the next paragraph here, again, still inside his mind, it introduces another character. A bit of a romance here, and he's thinking, oh, I wish, you know, that so-and-so was here with me. It's not even really worth reading. I'm such a self-critic. Now I'm reading this, and I'm like getting all nervous, like, why did I ever let anybody see this? Definitely not worth the light of day.
No.
But you get the point. Now, after that paragraph here about la li la, I'm so in love, we get, he noticed the red light late, and so, again, this paragraph shift denotes we're moving from thought to action, and we're back here with the forward momentum. He noticed a red light late and nearly didn't have time to stop. He stomped the brake and wrestled the wheel straight. Again, the Chevy Prism slid into the other lane before he corrected it and stopped. His front tires over the limit line. He pulled the handbrake and started collecting the scattered papers. Next paragraph, interior monologue. I was going to pull up real quick a paragraph someplace where we kind of get a mix here, and I think this paragraph is a decent example. Someone honked. He looked up from the papers to the now green light, so we're still in action. Cameron left the papers he'd not collected and moved on down the road. The torrent raged on. Drops heavy like syrup splattered on his windshields. He turned the radio up and thought, instead of a stack of essays, he'd like to have Allie sitting in the passenger seat. So we move there into this, from action into thought within the same paragraph. And it's fairly.
And I like that the thought that you're adding, the hand on Allie's knee and so forth, you're moving the page, so I lost the sentence.
Sorry.
Yeah, because she'd be wearing one of those little trademark skirts, right?
Right.
She'd be smiling. That at least what he's imagining and what's going on inside of his head is, again, not internally focused. It's internal thought, but it's not a self-centered, internally focused thought. He is imagining this woman next to him, and there's there's action within that internal thought that also keeps the momentum going. I like that, and that's the type of internal monologue I really enjoy seeing. You sort of have to have some of the deeper thoughts that maybe aren't actionable, but when I see this, I like that balance.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that there's a way to internalize external things, right?
Right.
To imagine something happening on the outside. Versus, I think what you're talking about is kind of that reflective kind of writing, the focused only on emotions, focused only on how we feel. And I think that perhaps is probably one of the weakest points of interior monologue when you're simply using it to describe an emotion. I felt sad. He looked happy. Those, or I guess he was happy, or he sounded happy. Those types of things aren't as powerful because they are, like you say, they're too internal. And the way I express my happiness is different than the way you express yours. Same thing with sorrow. There are some commonalities, but most of it is very, very individual. And that's really what we want to focus on, is those important, unique details that our characters are noticing that translate into the emotion, rather than just simply using the emotion as a shorthand for what's happening on the outside. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think that's what you're doing in this piece, is that you have internal monologue that is within action. It's sort of like not broken apart all into itself, but it's also interspersed well even within the same paragraph. And it comes across seamlessly. Like you said, you didn't have to italicize, you didn't do anything, you're in a third person, and yet you move back and forth in and out of his thoughts right along with the action.
Right.
It doesn't draw attention to itself. I think that's what I was trying to make a point of as well, is I like the internal monologues that don't necessarily draw attention to themselves, that they move seamlessly in and out of the action and advance the narrative themselves.
I agree. And I think another place that we want to focus on including interior monologue is going to be within dialogue. This can be a particularly powerful thing to do when you have an intense conversation and you want to drum up the tension. One easy way to do that is to juxtapose what a character says versus what a character thinks. And that will provide some tension. I'm trying to think of some examples here. But
yeah, I know we've talked about this before, because I remember, was it Rob Roberge who talked about this? I'm thinking when we were in grad school, right? The tension that can be created when we, the reader, are privy to knowing, what our character is actually really thinking or feeling, but what they are saying is different.
Right. For example, does this dress make my butt look big? And the character says, honey, it ain't the dress. Or that's what the character thinks, right? And then what they simply say is, I prefer a different color on you. Or they find some tactful way to express it. But, you've got that tension. And this is a lot of times where some of those great one-liners can come in. They come in the sense of an internal monologue rather than what we actually say out loud.
And that's a great opportunity for revealing character as well, because it really says, I'm going to use your does this make my butt look big example. Right. But if you had a character who in his head thought something like, oh, sweetheart, it's not the dress, right? But decides to approach it in a completely different way that we know is disingenuous, right? Whether that's to spare feelings, whether that's for whatever reason. But acting in a way that is opposite of what we are thinking or feeling tells your reader fundamental things about the type of person your character is.
Exactly, and then you can even juggle instead of juggling just action and thought, you can juggle dialogue and thought. You can have your character thinking about one thing when they are saying something else. I can have a conversation with somebody about X while I'm truly thinking about Y, and that balance there, that interplay, can deepen our understanding of who our characters are. I would say. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to give an example to that. In Laws of Motion, I actually have a scene where my character is actually having breakfast with his wife and his young daughter the morning after he's had an affair. And so he is sitting at the table with his family, eating the breakfast that his wife has made for him, looking at his little girl, and there is a back and forth, as you say, between the action that's going on at the table, the remembered action of what he's done in his head, the dialogue that he is having with his wife, and again, sort of that internal monologue about the entire situation that he is very aware that he is in, all interplaying at one time.
Well, I want to read that. That sounds fantastic. And what a great setup to be remembering something that is so sensory rich, and yet has such an emotional weight to it, juxtaposed against something that should be a simple, fun-filled breakfast, perhaps, or this act of normalcy in a very abnormal circumstances. And that can really be great. Though I think it still falls under the same things. You don't want to do too much, just a line here or there.
Right.
I was reading in somebody's work, and I noticed that the interior monologue, the moments of interior monologue, were really isolated, and that when the character was alone, I would get a couple paragraphs of interior monologue. But when the character was with somebody and or speaking with someone, the interior monologue almost completely vanished. And I think it's fundamental. I think it's necessary to be able to balance both of those, to be able to weave them together in such a way to where the thoughts are not intrusive, but they are, I guess, like salt. You want to sprinkle it liberally, but you don't want to over-season something. It can definitely season a conversation. It can season a period of action in your prose.
I agree, and I think that whenever we focus in those particular sections, like you said, when we isolate that interior monologue, again, I think it makes your character seem a little self-indulgent, and it also, for me, it can also, like I said before, stifle the pacing of the book, because in any moment when your character is sort of alone and just thinking in their heads, the action is stopped. That driving force forward is on pause. Mm-hmm. And it's okay to pause occasionally, but you don't want to pause too long, because all that does is signal to your reader that, like, oh, now's a good time to put the book down.
Right. You want that rest. If we're talking about this in musical terms, you want to rest sometimes. Sometimes you want a moment of silence. You want a moment of quiet, but you don't want too much of it, because then it's like, well, I guess the song's over. But just a beat here or there. And if you've tuned in much, or if you've talked with me much, you'll know I tend to go to musical terms, even though I don't know much about music, to describe writing, because it's a very musical thing. The sounds, the rhythms, the moments of intense action versus the moments of stillness and quiet. The juxtaposition of these things can be super, super powerful, and that's, I think, ultimately our goal. Interior monologue can be a way to have that stillness in between moments of action, or it can be something to bring action, to internalize something that is usually experienced externally. Did that make sense?
I love that, absolutely, and I love that you say that, because I think about writing in musical terms all the time. I think I've mentioned before, when we've maybe discussed structure or dialogue at some other point, but that one of my favorite things to do is to print off my pages so I can look at them visually, that I will spread them out on the floor because I like to be able to visually see the flow of the story, where the breaks of dialogue are, where the big chunks of, whether it be description or internal monologue exist within a narrative. Because just like musical notes on a page, when you are looking at sheet music, you can look at sheet music and see a structure, a flow. You should be able to see that on the page as well. So I always tell students that I have in class, like, please print off your stuff. Don't just look at it on a computer screen. Challenge yourself to look at it on the page printed off in front of you so that you can see, like sheet music, how your story is playing out.
Right. Right.
You're not pausing too long, that you're not moving too quickly, so on and so forth. Yeah. Exactly.
And as a matter of fact, if we do that, I'm going to screen share again real quick so that you guys can visually see exactly what you're talking about. So take this paragraph that we were looking at earlier, and I highlight the moments or the sentences of action, right? We've got right up to here, all of this, I'm trying to think of a good color that's going to be, if I put it in bold and then I change the color to, let's say, a nice dark blue. Juxtaposed against, here we have and thought, right? Instead of a stack of essays, he'd like to have Ali sitting next to him. So the rest of this is going to be thought. And so if we denote that in some sort of orange, right? And we can go through here. If you look up at the beginning, we've got this first part here, this first whole thing here, we said was a blue, and then we had the thought, and the problem was the rest of this was thought. That's a lot of orange, right?
Right.
So
and
if I put that in
and
orange,
that's exactly it, because whenever you have highlighted that, you have visually signified for yourself
Are you there, Heather? Oh my goodness, Heather has dropped out. I will hang on here a moment. She had something beautiful and wonderful and brilliant to say, I'm sure, and now I'm feeling very, very lonely without another host here. So I'm going to jump over to the comment section here and see if there are any questions. Therese says she needs to print out to see what she really has on the page. By the way, thank you guys, Therese and Molly Joe for popping in, and Quotidian Light, Maya, thanks for stopping by and making some comments here, having some comments. Appreciate it. I'll give her a few more minutes. Oh, looks like she's coming back. In the meantime, while I wait for her, I will ask the room, do you guys have any examples of authors that you feel really handle this well, this juxtaposition of interior monologue and dialogue, interior monologue and action? Who can you think of that really kind of handles that very well? I would say Stephen King does it very well in the books that I've read, especially Misery was one of the best books I saw by him that really had a lot of this, because if you haven't read Misery, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept, but here's this guy who's been in this terrible car wreck and is unable to really leave this bed that he's trapped in. It's just him and this one other character, this crazy, crazy woman. You know from their dialogue, you immediately understand the character that has kidnapped him, this crazy woman that has kidnapped him. You understand everything about her through her dialogue and the way her actions, etc. But the way he internalizes that and the way he interprets a lot of those actions are very insightful and really help us to understand that character as well. How does he basically struggle for his life when he has absolutely no way out of this dire situation? And the fact that he starts comparing himself to Scheherazade, I think I said that correctly. I'm sure somebody will correct me if I didn't. And that whole extended metaphor that he establishes there is really rather brilliant. So I would say that Stephen King's probably one of the better ones that I've seen handling that. Molly Jo says she doesn't have any questions tonight. This is a pretty thorough podcast. Fantastic. Well, we are running out. Thanks for not having a question there, Molly. I needed you. I need a question. So, since we don't have any more questions and we don't have any more hosts, I guess I'll go ahead and sign off for tonight. So, thank you all for listening, and until next week, good writing.